My name is Ivan Berg. I'm the tech lead for the data platform at a financial services company called Storebrand. And I've been working with data and data warehouses and data platforms for about 17 years now, and been working with Storebrand and our new platform for 2.5 years. And I'll talk about how we scale from 0 DBT developers to around 35 active now, and with a platform team that's currently 3 people. So today's agenda, I'll go through our starting point, how we approach the new platform, and with key learnings from the initial phase. Then I'll dig into data governance, data security, and a bit about dbt mesh, and lastly, where we go from here. So fun fact, we were actually founded in 1767, which was 9 years prior to the US Constitution. And most people will recognize, or that's when we launched insurance against fire. And most people in Norway would recognize our offerings within insurance, but we have several other verticals as well. We're all focused on pensions, banking, and asset management, as well as insurance. And the verticals are their own entities, and they have their own organizations within the organization, within the larger enterprise. However, we want the customer experience to be one, regardless of your entry point. And this is also what we want to do when working with data. But we start out with some challenges. And challenges is that verticals mean silos. It means little cooperation, it means duplication of effort, and degraded quality over time. But even with silos, we have data sharing across verticals. And consumers experience that it's slow, takes a while to do any changes, data ownership is unclear, and consumers don't have access to the logic behind the data products, making it a lot of black boxes. So this also leads to challenges with regulatory compliance, data security. And this begs the question, how can we work more efficiently with data? And that led to 2 theories that we had. 1, we needed a new platform that could span all verticals. And 2, we needed a new way to organize work around data. So I'll go through the approach we had, where we wanted to verify and choose technologies, verify the ways of working. And I'll now go through the key learnings from the initial phase. And our approach was to start with one vertical that had everything from the previous slide. Their own tech stack, their own data warehouse, their own data team, even though there were like 2 people in the beginning, their own source systems, and effectively, they were their own lone island in an enterprise. But they still delivered some data to the rest of the organization. So we wanted to get their data team up and running to be an autonomous team on the platform. And it takes time building a data team. And in the first vertical, I spent the majority of my first year working as their architect, developing, tutoring them, onboarding, creating frameworks and architecture and so on. And we had a small team. And that meant that we could drive the project forward ourselves and correct some of the earlier mistakes without too much pain. And here you can see the first high-level architecture that we had with dbt and Snowflake, and we can still use it today. It wasn't long before we realized one major thing. We had opted for the wrong approach when it came to Snowflake. We went with 3 Snowflake accounts, dev, test, and prod. And I'd argue that it's much easier to much easier to secure one account. It's easier to deal with integrations, do Azure apps and services with one account, and it's much easier to create a good developer experience with one account. And we have done the same for ingestion tools. And as we're a lean platform team, we want to buy and not build. And we have found it's very difficult to find tools, ingestion tools, that can deliver on scalability and security and functionality and developer experience with a pricing model that scales as we scale our platform. I'll come a bit back to that. Starting with the DBT and Snowflake side of things. Do not uncritically lift and shift. We did this in the first day with the first data team, and they tried to port code over that was written for a different era to DBT and Snowflake. And it was inefficient, it ignored best practices, and it ignored features in Snowflake that was fixing the problem that they were coding themselves out of. And they were left with the same technical debt that they had. No one that were going to work on the project had prior experience. And when that happens, you usually turn to the documentation. And with minor tweaks, the best practices from DBT and Snowflake has worked well for us. And when scaling the platform, it's so much easier for me to say that, okay, I can go to any data team and say, okay, read the docs. We have followed the best practices. We have changed this and this and this. Maybe put some guardrails around this, but otherwise, keep it simple. And lastly, leverage open source packages. We use DBT SnowMask for masking policies, we use DBT expectations for testing, and we use Select Dev's package for cost monitoring, among a few. Do not reinvent the wheel if you don't need to. Organizing data teams is interesting. And we have found that we need a data team, as we don't think centralized data development scales. And as we scaled up, we realized it's difficult to learn a new platform. The experiences of people being onboarded to our platform ranges from ETL developers in Informatica, ETL developers in SSIS, Python developers, business analysts, DBAs. And everyone comes with a different background, different goal, and different motivation. And in that sense, I found that I want to reduce the cognitive load of the data teams. I want them to exclusively focus on DBT and Snowflake in the beginning at least. And let the platform team handle the complexities. Because the platform has a lot of moving parts. We have maybe about 30 different source systems now, data flowing in, but the interface of the data team in the beginning starts when data is loaded to Snowflake. For a larger enterprise, some function makes sense to have across different verticals. Cybersecurity for one, obvious. But I'd say that the same goes for data, and hence the platform team was born. You need the same infrastructure, you need the data, you need a great developer experience, you need the developer environment, and everyone has the same needs. So hence the platform team was born. And the platform team was also the enablement team in the beginning, but we have since scaled to have an enablement team in its own that act as internal consultants to other data teams that's getting started. When we onboard new teams, there will be a lot of databases, grants, roles, and so on created. And we have about over 200 databases in Snowflake, 600-700 roles. And it's obvious that we can't do that in a manual process. And when speaking to data owners, system owners, their number one concern is data security. What are we going to do with their data in the cloud, in a new platform that they haven't heard about? How are we securing the data? Who has access to the data? How's the data being used? So we need to spend a lot of time gaining trust of the data owners as well. And thirdly, we think we need distributed ownership to scale. So let's dig a bit down into data security. And based on the concerns from the data owners, we need to automate our infrastructure in a safe and compliant manner. And we need to have some frameworks around data security and data governance to gain their trust. Because we need to follow strict regulatory compliance at Storebrand. And there are some key questions that we need to answer. And with an on-prem database, at least in the old days, there were no granular access control. If I had access to the database, I had access to all the data. And we usually let the business intelligence fix the role-based access control. And all the data sets and fields that could contain sensitive data needs to, such as PII, needs to be masked and tagged so that users who should not have access to the data don't see the data. And the same goes for business units across geographies, as Norwegian operations can only see Norwegian data, Swedish operations can only see Swedish data. I don't know if you've seen the matrix of account permissions in the enterprise version of dbt Cloud, but there are like 17 different roles. Everything from billing admin, who has right access to billing, job admin, who can do a lot of jobs. You have developers, you have access rights for marketplace apps, webhooks, and so on. And I'm sure there's good reason for that, but we don't want to go down that road. When working with data, we have discovered that we only need two personas. You need an engineer, and you need an analyst. And to define them, we can use Tristan Handy's description. An engineer for us is typically a dbt developer who writes dbt models and creates pull requests and puts them in production. The analyst, on the other hand, typically creates, consumes dashboards in Power BI, or has access to typically a production schema, which you could say is usually a schema equals a data product, and performs analysis on that data. So we create analyst and engineer roles in Azure, and they are synced to Snowflake as function roles. And function roles is part of Snowflake's role-based access control. It allows us to grant users permissions by assigning them roles, which they then have in turn have access to perform certain tasks, like querying a database. Or in this case, function roles have access to access roles, who in turn have access to underlying databases and data. In practice, there's no difference between access roles and function roles, but separating them into two means that we can separate the role for a business function with a role that controls access to the data, and then we can make changes to the function roles without altering access to the underlying database. And this allows for a very granular access that helps us from over-provisioning, makes auditing easier, and it's easier to scale, as we can then reuse the same access role across function roles. And you'll also see that the engineer does not have right access to production, because everything that goes to production must go through dbt and SlimCI. Schemas is the lowest granular grants that we give for practical reasons, because we want autonomous data teams within dbt and Snowflake. And that means they need to be able to perform everything in Snowflake for schema level objects. If they had to come to a platform team every time they needed to rename a table, that wouldn't scale. And for data analysts, more often than not, they only have access to one schema in the mart, as I said. It's equivalent of a data product. The last piece of the puzzle for data security is masking and role-based access policy in Snowflake. And we have 4 ways of looking at any data set in Snowflake. You either see all the data unmasked, some data unmasked, all the data masked or some data masked. And with policies in Snowflake, we can make that happen without duplicating any data. And for data masking in Snowflake, we use dbt snowmask, as I said earlier. We do that with dbt and let the data teams handle it themselves by tagging individual columns in the model, in the configured model. With row-based access policies, for instance, as I said, operations in Sweden can only see Swedish data. And it's still easy enough, but I can show you how we did. I'm not saying this is the best way to do it, but this is how we do it to let the data teams handle it themselves. So we need to create all the permutations of permissions for any object. With many roles, this will be an insane amount of rows. So we create seeds to break it down. And doing this in seeds allows the data team to own this process themselves. First, we have a seed, which includes which roles should have access to which values for a specific column. Secondly, we have a seed that includes which objects have that specific column. We have a dbt model that creates all permutations in a table called entitlements. And this is a table that Snowflake uses to look up to see if the logged in user have access to the data for any object that has a policy connected to it. We then create the macro that creates a row access policy, and we apply that in a dbt model in prehooks and posthooks. So this is how everything comes together. Databases, access roles, and function roles are created by Terraform, except function roles that users will apply to. These are created and synced, created by Azure and synced to Snowflake. Everything from schemas and below is handled in dbt. We use Permafrost for grants, which is an open source project. It's working, but at scale, it's slow. And it's also a dead open source project, so it does not have support for a lot of the schema level objects that we want to use in Snowflake. So we're actively looking at something that can replace that, potentially Titan. TJ sits there. But we'll see. dbt project is also created by Terraform. And to sum it up, you need automation and infrastructure. If you go beyond one team, 2 personas is enough. Let the data teams handle everything from schemas and below, including policies. And I say there's no good ways of automatically dealing with grants at scale for Snowflake. Right. We're done with data security. Let's talk about dbt mesh. And to me, dbt mesh isn't just about distributed ownership and scaling the platform. It's about developer experience. And to get developers interested, we need to prove that our platform is better than what they had before. And for us, it was released at a very good time in Coalesce in London last year, because we were just scaling out our first vertical when that happened. And I left one thing out on the architecture on the POC, our export databases. We knew we had a lot of data that needed to be exported, but we didn't want to give external users access to the mark of the first data team, as things break. So we created internal and external databases that will function as contracts, where we move data from the march to the internal export databases with one schema per business unit that was on the consuming end. It worked, but it had some significant overhead in model sprawl, infrastructure for roles, databases, grants, broken data lineage on the consumer end, and no contracts on the original data product. So as a technical solution, dbt mesh works better in all ways. And as I mean, dbt mesh is partially about DevX, I'll just add our development workflow as well. And we need to get buy-ins from other teams. And if you ever try to deploy changes between dev, test, and prod with legacy ETL tools, you will know that it does not take a whole lot of convincing if you have a workflow like this. But it's still about keeping it simple. As you can see, we test all our releases and PRs on state modify +1 to test everything downstream. If it works, we say it's ready for production. And it's also quite automated. And for someone that's coming from a traditional data warehousing background, this is quite a game changer. As for mesh itself, this is not a complete picture of how it looks, but you'll get the point. We have a lot of data that's being shared across verticals. And let's say the analyst in retail insurance that's trying to get correct premiums across the customer base, they need data from all verticals for their models to work. But they should not have access to the source system that they don't own. And we have like 8 systems that we define as source systems. Because if they have that, they will end up creating their own view of the world, and you'll be back at duplication of effort and degrade the quality over time again. Sorry. So dbt mesh provides better governance than before and better quality, but it does have a challenge. Because now the downstream data teams are reliant on upstream data teams delivering. So even though mesh makes the experience better, we have recently come across the challenge of dbt mesh in itself. Because we have autonomous data teams. And that means the data teams themselves decide how they want to work. And we have one data team and one vertical that's using 6-week focus periods, where they will prioritize strict prioritization for those 6 weeks of what they're going to work on. And then from left field, you have a downstream data team that needs something done. How do you solve for that? We haven't really solved for it, except for having pragmatic platform team, enablement team, usually service-oriented teams, but it's a challenge. And I'll also add our operating model between platform and data teams, just to stress the point that we want the data teams to own as much as possible, and specifically around data masking, role-based access policy, deletions of GDPR, and so on. Because we, especially with a platform team of 3 people, we can't go around policing how they're using their own data. They need to take ownership of this themselves. Right, where do we go from here? I'll share a tech stack, because everyone loves tech stacks. And I'll point out a few things. We are happy with dbt Explorer. It's been a game changer for end users of all tail processes. And system and data owners can now finally see where their data is coming from, how the data is used, and who's using the data. This has also allowed us to postpone the purchase of a fully fledged data catalog that I think that we will need eventually, because we have a lot of use cases outside of dbt and Snowflake that's out of scope for this talk. As for ingestion tools, we're using Click Replicate for CDC against many of our core systems. That gives us near real-time replication at a fraction of the cost of some of the competitors, but the user experience leaves a bit to be desired. We sadly also use Azure Data Factory because we have a core system that's Teradata on-premise in a different country that we don't own, and there's not a whole lot of tools that can handle that. And we recently adopted both Sling and DLT, so quite cutting edge for dealing with database replication, APIs, SharePoints, Jira, and the like. Lastly, we also use Dagster for orchestration, actually. So it's both, again, a lot of use cases outside of dbt and Snowflake. And so I'm running out of time. Very future high-level roadmap. I can say that we want to focus on scaling the platform, distributing more and more ownership to the data teams. We need to, part of the ROI on the platform is turning off legacy data warehouses, so we obviously need to do that. And we have a lot of platform internal things that we want to do. Yes. That's it. Thank you. Questions?
On your roadmap, you had a marketplace for internal data. What kind of ideas do you guys have for that, if anything yet?
It's a very nice way of saying a data catalog, I guess. That we want to surface the data products that the teams are building in a way that we want that the business users can understand or easily find it, how it's being used, or how they can get access to it, and what it is about. Just to drive adoption, more adoption across the enterprise.
Quickly say, like, for your engineers, if they can't deploy to prod and it's a really long-running pipeline,
Sorry?
how do you deal with critical issues that surface itself in prod and you need to deal with it immediately?
How to deal with things that...
If there's something, if there's a change in prod that you have to deal with,
Hmm?
if your data teams can't represent.
Well, they have to go through a controlled, governed process with dbt and SlimCI. It doesn't take a whole lot. They need to test their changes if something breaks. Any more?
So I'm currently in the process of setting up our role-based access controls in Snowflake, and I'd be curious to know, outside of the slide that you had that is creating the policies, what other tips might you have for trying to make that process easier, or did you have any like big light bulb ideas that really help that process?
Are you specifically asking about... I can do it. Specifically asking about the policies themselves or the role-based access control?
More the role-based access controls. Like I know that you had a bullet up there that said that it's not easy to scale any of that, but was there anything that helped your process or made that any of that easier?
I think, I might not answer your question, but I think that the one of the light bulbs we had is that we needed, every time we wanted to create a new dbt project, it was done because there was some data that the user did not had access to that another data team did not have access to. But other than that, we created a lot of roles, the read roles and the write roles for all databases, and applying them in the light bulb we first had is that if you do it manually, it will be a very, very long manual script. So even though we're not very happy with permafrost, abstracting this process to YAML makes it a lot easier to govern. And the other light bulb is, I'm guessing that this is part of the process that we do not want to give out to data teams. We want to maintain the grants and permissions centrally, but we're always very in tight collaboration with the business and the data owners. So if someone asks us to give them grants, we will pass it on to them. So some good collaboration there. Other than that, it's the Snowflake docs is good.
So I have a pretty technical question, I guess. We have a very similar setup to what you guys are doing. And when it comes to like masking policies, how do you make sure that if one of your data engineers messes up and forgets to apply a masking policy, and maybe might accidentally expose data, how do you make sure that they don't forget about that part?
That's a good question. I can say that currently we are not making sure, other than that we get them to discuss with their data owners, and in the process where they need to be very aware that which columns should be tagged and which should not be tagged. But we don't, as I said, we don't go around policing if they're doing the right or wrong thing. And then the question itself, does the data engineer need to see the data or not? That's also a question. I think you were first.
Related question. I saw you do a zero copy from your prod environment into a test environment. Do you copy masked columns? Do you copy PII into your test environment?
The test environment is basically dbt cloud schemas that no person has access to. It's only the dbt system user. So no one will see those. In the back. The question was, any tips on how I make sure, how I can convince someone that a single account in Snowflake is better than multiple accounts? It's a good question. You need to have frameworks in place and say that logical separation could be, if done right, with the right frameworks, the right ownership, the right roles and grants and so on, and automate the processes, then logical separation can be just as secure as physical separation, I guess. At least that's my opinion. But you can say that, I mean, the business was not very involved in us going from 3 accounts to 1 account. We have, the platform team has a lot of, saying how we want to architect the platform. And, stakeholders trust us.
First of all, hi, Clement.
Hi.
I didn't catch what alternatives to permafrost are you looking at? Because we also use it and I want to.
Alternatives to permafrost. There is, you have Terraform. I don't want to go do Terraform. Maybe TJ is better to answer this, but we're playing around with his project called Titan. I'm not entirely sure if that's going to do well with grants or not. But we'll see. I'll try to get him to make it good enough for grants. But I'm honestly not sure if there are any good. There might be some services I can buy that can do that. I don't know. Let's discuss that later.